Every 2 years, millions of Americans participate in an event that is so rigged it deprives them of fundamental freedoms. It's called congressional elections. Today, I'm going to show you how we can regain those freedoms by abolishing a mechanism known as gerrymandering and establishing a federal mandate for independent redistricting committees. If you'd like to gain the insight necessary to make American democracy work better for you and your family, then I suggest you listen. My name is Alex Wellington. I've studied political science and researched this topic for years. Our discussion is going to start with an examination of the problem that is gerrymandering. Then we are going to look at the solution, which is a federal mandate for independent redistricting committees. Finally, we'll visualize what this looks like in the real world. Let's get started. So, as I mentioned, America is confronted with the problem of gerrymandering. This concept refers to the act of congressional district maps being drawn to favor partisan or racial groups. That's according to Joe A. Chen and Jonathan Roden of the Quarterly Journal of Political Science. Essentially, it gives politicians the power to draw districts that manipulate the electorate so they win more seats than they actually deserve. This was put on full display in the 2012 elections, according to Sam Wang of the New York Times, when Democrats won 1.4 million more votes than Republicans nationwide, but walked away with 33 fewer seats. This problematic nature of gerrymandering has been condemned by many, and recently President Obama acknowledged the urgency needed to abolish it in a statement given to USA Today. He said that gerrymandering will determine the course of action for every major policy that we care about for the next decade, and that we need to create a fair maps movement right now. Now, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you ought to hear this warning because both parties weaponize gerrymandering and it's damaging our democracy. As Dr. Jeremy Mayer said in an interview with the Washington Post, it gives representatives the power to choose their voters rather than voters choosing their representatives. As a consequence, parties can push policies that are not supported by a majority. This means that politicians, not voters, will determine the fate of issues such as racial discrimination laws or firearm liberties or LGBTQ rights. So now that we see how gerrymandering disenfranchises Americans, how do we abolish it? The solution that I recommend is the federal government require a law for every state to establish an independent redistricting committee. In essence, this gives a nonpartisan group the power of redistricting, thus making districts more fair. According to an attorney, Nancy Wang, who works with Voters Not Politicians, in a statement she gave to the Detroit Free Press, this system is infinitely better than the system most states currently have because it's more transparent and forces our congressional delegation to be more representative of the voters' will. So, fortunately, there are a few states that do require independent redistricting committees. And this allows for a comparative analysis of elections, and that proves that these committees are a good solution to gerrymandering. For example, Arizona has an independent group draw their districts, and in the 2018 elections, Democrats won 50% of the statewide vote, which earned them 5 seats in the House. Republicans earned 49% of the statewide vote, and that earned them 4 seats in the House, according to data by Politico. Now compare this to a state like North Carolina, who does not have independent redistricting. According to the Brennan Center, the statewide vote was split 50-50 between both parties in 2018. However, Democrats won only 3 of 13 seats. Evidently, you don't need a PhD to recognize how independent redistricting committees force the government to be more representative of their citizens. Unfortunately, there are still those who oppose this solution, and they commonly cite 2 main objections. First, they say that this mandate is an unconstitutional overreach of federal power, and that states should be able to make their own districts. This argument is disingenuous, though, because state actors would still have the authority for redistricting. It would just prevent malicious partisanship and protect the general welfare of citizens, which is actually required under the preamble of the United States Constitution. The second objection is that it is impossible to establish a group independent of political bias. Therefore, it's pointless to try. Well, it may hold true that partisanship is pervasive. However, it is ridiculous to say we shouldn't try independent redistricting. A group of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans and independents would have a far less collective bias than a group of politicians from the same party. So now that we understand this solution, let's visualize how it would work in the real world. And we can do this by considering what it would look like with and without independent redistricting. So first, let's start with the negative. If we let gerrymandering run its course, then in 10 to 20 years, our country will be more polarized, more undemocratic, and more volatile than it is right now. Imagine a pro-life majority being forced to live in a state where they fund abortions with taxpayer dollars. Or imagine an anti-gun majority being forced to live in a state where they have open carry laws for AR-15s. If either of those realities unsettles you, then consider this alternative. If we implement independent redistricting, then in 10 to 20 years, our country will be more representative of its citizens and more collaborative and more stable. No longer will politicians be able to tear apart communities and neighborhoods with dirty politics. Instead, imagine a world where you and most of America actually is pleased with your representation in Congress. This issue is not the difference between one mundane policy or another. It's the difference between a peaceful coexistence or a dangerous country on the brink of civil war. Now, before I finish, I'd like each of you to join me in the fight against gerrymandering. You can take action immediately by calling your local congressman and conditioning your vote on their support for what we've discussed. In summary, you can say that gerrymandering is an undemocratic problem that can be solved with a federal mandate for independent redistricting committees so that you don't have to live in a world where malicious politicians have no regard for the majority consensus. Now, I hope you've grown to care about this issue as much as I do. Whether or not you like it, this is our country and we might as well make it as virtuous as possible. So just like John F. Kennedy said, let us not seek the Republican answer or the Democratic answer, but the right answer. Thank you. So now I'd like to open it up for a few questions, if you have them.
I have a question. You talked about the fact that gerrymandering was harmful to both parties, but all the examples seem to be more harmful to the Democrats. Is it also harmful to the Republicans?
Yeah, so first I'd like to say that recently you are correct. It has mostly hurt Democrats as opposed to Republicans, but there is an instance, I think in 2016, or around then in Maryland, where Democrats were actually put forward a map that was disadvantageous to Republicans. But the reason that is because if you remember in 2008, President Obama won the presidency, and the last time congressional maps were redrawn was in 2010. And it is very typical for when one party wins the presidency, for the opposing party to have a wave election in the midterms, the next midterms, which would be 2010. So in 2010, a bunch of Republicans won their state legislators, which put them in charge of drawing the congressional maps, which is why today you see it's more advantageous to Republicans than Democrats. However, the next year that these maps will be drawn is in 2020 to 2021. So you may see a change in that if we don't enact these solutions now.
I have a question. So when was this gerrymandering line thing put in place?
Yeah, so the gerrymandering mechanism, which is the congressional district lines that you're referring to, It was I'm not sure of the exact date. I know it was the 1800s. It was pretty early, actually, into the founding of our country. And back then, it did have some significance, but it didn't matter as much as it matters now, because we have voting records and political data that can show politicians like the exact neighborhoods and communities they need to cut in and out of in order to win more seats than they actually should. So at this point, technology has made it to the point where it's very unfair, and we should have honestly got rid of it altogether back then, but exceptionally, or definitely now. Any other questions? All right, thank you.